Hi everyone, this is Chris from Victor X Games, and this is our video introducing our game Song for War Mediterranean Theater and a lot of the enhancements that we've been working on over the course of the last 12 months. So we've had a lot of input on how to make some improvements, all the way from the mechanics through design to scenarios and all kinds of different things in order to make the game even better. And we got a lot of good input from play testers, from reviewers such as Zilla Blitz, Wargamers Needful Things, Discriminating Gamer, Board Game Nation, Ardwolf's Lair, Armchair Dragoons, and others. So shout out to all those folks that have been great in helping us take the game forward. So Song for War Mediterranean Theater, at its base, is a tabletop strategy game for 2 to 4 players set in the Mediterranean theater of World War II. Now, one of the great things that we found out over the last 12 months in order to the input that we received is creating new scenarios. And the purpose here is to really create scenarios that would appeal to if you have just a couple of hours of play, or if you really want to spend a long time on Saturday, spending a lot of time getting deep in the Mediterranean theater. And instead of the prior situation, we now have 5 total scenarios. The first scenario is the historical one we've always had, and that's the 1942 start for Operation Torch, 2 to 4 players, the Allied nations of Great Britain and the United States versus the Axis nations of Italy and Germany. And that lasts about 4 to 7 hours for the entire theater. Right, all the way from Gibraltar in the west, all the way to Alexandria in the east, and the Mediterranean Sea. The second scenario, which we've had historically as well, is 1943. So that starts at a later time after the initiation of Operation Torch. About 2 to 4 players again, the entire theater again, but it only lasts about 2 to 4 hours of game time. Right? So it can be accomplished in a single Friday night if so interested. And then we also added 3 new scenarios, sort of shorter modular scenarios that allow different gamers to have fun playing Song for War Mediterranean Theater. The first is the invasion of Italy, which happened in 1943. This is 2 to 3 hours, also 2 to 4 players. And the way we set it up is that, our game board can be flipped and is modular so that you can have these different scenarios and play these different maps, and one of them will be Italy, blown up so that you can play this particular scenario. The last 2 scenarios, scenarios 4 and 5, are shorter. The first is North Africa, which is 2 players and puts Great Britain, the Desert War, versus Germany in North Africa. Should take you about 1 to 2 hours to play. The last scenario is going to be the invasion of Crete, Germany's invasion of Crete, in May of 1941, which will also be for 2 players and take 1 to 2 hours. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is we don't necessarily have a solo bot to play. However, the game can be played solo with just a few changes in the rules, which we'll outline in the rulebook, and it's very easy to follow should you want to play solo. So let's talk a little bit about what the game is versus what the game isn't, because we get a lot of great questions about this. Song for Mediterranean Theater is a game that is open-ended. Okay? It really asks you to really prosecute the war as you see fit as the leader of that particular nation. It's not a recreation of history. It's not a simulation. It starts you at a point in time and then allows you to make all the decisions as the commander in collaboration with your teammate. It's collaborative in that, and it's also simultaneous, right? The war wasn't fought nation by nation, and neither is our game played nation by nation. Allied nations and Axis nations move together, fight together, battle together, and either take objectives and win or lose the war together. So it's much more collaborative and open-ended. The mechanics are, by design, simple to learn, but hard to master. There's a lot of options, a lot of choices, a lot of trade-offs, as with any good strategy game should be. So you'll be multitasking, you'll be fighting, you'll be battling, you'll be planning ahead together, which really makes for a lot of fun. What the game isn't is it's not a gritty, crunchy war game by design. It's operational or theater level and not tactical level by deliberate design. One of the questions we get a lot too is what's its difference from Axis and Allies, and it's markedly different in design, in pace, in many of the scenarios, and just in terms of how the mechanics work, and particularly around movement and combat, are distinctly different from, we believe, any other war game or any other tabletop strategy game for that matter out there. So if you're looking to really spend just a couple of hours on a Friday night, as you're a casual gamer and you want to spend some time in World War II, we have the scenario and the setup for you in Song for War Mediterranean Theater. Or if you're a World War II buff and you're looking to spend 7 or 8 hours on a Saturday with your buddies going deeply into the Mediterranean theater of World War II, we've got the game for you. So let's talk a little bit about what comes in the box and the components of the game. Our rule book. So right opening it up here, a couple things that are sort of worth mentioning. First is you can see we have a 54 by 31 inch game board. We really wanted to go for a large, colorful game board because it really gives a big panoramic sense of the entire theater. The board itself is dual-sided, so on the back side, what you're looking at now is the full theater, of course. On the back side of the board is where you'll find the maps for the other scenarios, including Italy, North Africa, and Crete. And the board is also modular, so it's not one single board that you need to flip the whole thing over. You'll be able to modularize it, so if you play a particular scenario, you can flip that over and play that scenario and not have to look at the entire board at any given point. So it's really, very customizable in that way. Also, a lot of the components, we got a lot of components here, big box, high quality components, 500 wood pieces, that'll be also silk screened. The game will come with plastic trays for all the pieces. The player aid, which is sort of obviously the key component of the game in order to play it, is going to be heavy card stock. That's also dual-sided, by the way. On the front side, right, having your units and sort of the mechanics. In the back side, having sort of setup as well as the abilities of many of the units and the stages and phases of the game. So it's a one-stop shop in how to play and what to do. There's also national support cards for each nation. Has its own unique deck of national support cards that includes unique units and upgraded units, or specific strategy cards or economic benefits and technology advancements and that sort of thing. So each nation has one of those, and those will be heavy card stock, and there's 64 total national support cards in the game. There's also a hidden fleet mechanic in the game, so we have each nation has its own hidden fleet dial that allows you to keep the fleet off the board, but also track its movement for causing stress to all of your enemies, of course. And where would Operation Torch be if we didn't have a hidden fleet mechanic? So that and a lot more: battle dice, trackers, objective tiles, and lots of great stuff in the game component-wise. So let's talk about how you win the game. Like any war, the key is to control objectives. And in Song for War Mediterranean Theater, there are 17 objectives in the game. The objectives are the colored spaces on the board, such as you can see here with the laser pointer. There is Tunis, Bizerte, for example, are two of them. And there are these colored spaces represent the nation that controls them at the start of the game versus the nation that needs to control them to win toward the end of the game. These 17 objectives each come with a set of victory points, some of them worth more than others. And by controlling these is really the crux of how you win the game, by amassing a certain amount of required victory points for each side. In addition to the objectives, where most of the victory points are had, we have two other sources of victory points in the game. The first is airfields. Now, the airfields are gray spaces. There are 5 of those, and you can see here. Here's the Bone Airfield, right? Here, Algeria. And then there are also defensive lines, of which there are 2 defensive lines in the game. The Mareth line here, as well as there's one in the Balkans, the Metaxas line. So 17 objectives, 5 airfields, and the 2 defensive lines. By combinations and mixes of these is how you're able to really control the theater and ultimately determine victory for the Axis or the Allies. Now, at the start of the 1942 as well as the 1943 scenarios, which is accurate and true for history, the Axis really control most of the theater. In these scenarios, right, the Allies are the ones with Operation Torch doing the invading. Each of the objectives, the airfields, and the defensive lines have a tile. And the tiles are shaped specifically in order to give you a sense and add up the number of victory points each side has. So this is the 42 scenario starts at the beginning, and as you can see, almost the entire board is controlled by the Axis. The only thing the Allies control at the start of 1942 is Gibraltar, Malta, Alexandria, and Algiers, which is really was supposed to emulate where Operation Torch landed. Other than that, it's an Axis control. So it's incumbent upon the Allies to be aggressive, especially for the Allies. You are the invaders. If you don't reach, you check for victory points each stage, right? And if the Allies do not reach the required level of victory points to win the game, then the Axis win by default. So the Allies have to continue to be aggressive in order to take the objectives, airfields, and defensive lines away from the Axis and thereby win the game. So obviously, right, in order to play the game, it comes down to the units and deploying the units for each nation. So there's a total of 15 standard units, and each nation has access to these standard units on the player aid. All the player aids are the same in that regard. You have air transports, fighters, light bombers, heavy bombers, sea transports, subs, destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, battleships, And then for the land, you have land transports, you have infantry, tanks, artillery, and anti-air. Now, each of these standard units has what we call the core attributes. This includes each unit has a movement, and that represents the maximum number of spaces that unit can move. Then a second attribute is armor, which we'll get to in a little more details in a second. But armor basically is a reflection of how difficult it is to destroy the unit. There are 3 levels of armor. Blue is the lightest, yellow medium, and red heavy. There's firepower, which is sort of the mirror opposite of the armor. It represents the likelihood and the ability of that unit to destroy an enemy. Again, there are 3 levels, blue, yellow, and red. We'll get to that more in a second. Then each unit has its own set of abilities. One of the things we really wanted to incorporate is some of the unique abilities of these actual units in history, such as the abilities of submarines to submerge, or the use of sonar to detect subs, or, for example, some units have AA built in, or range, or the ability to have heavier defense in mountains. So there's a lot of different abilities for each of these standard units that you need to think about when playing the game. And the last is just cost. So during resupply, when you want to purchase and place new units on the board, here's how much each of the units costs. So let's spend a little time on the most important mechanic about this, and that's armor and firepower. So I mentioned armor, blue, yellow, red, and the armor represents how difficult it is to destroy that unit in battle. Okay? Now the firepower is what's matched up against it. Again, blue, yellow, and red. But a couple of interesting things on firepower. You'll see here, for example, in the fighter. The fighter has a blue firepower, as denoted by the background. But also these wings indicate which enemy units it can actually destroy. Not every unit in war, of course, can destroy every other unit. We don't really see a point in infantry hurting a battleship, right, for example, or a lone fighter being able to necessarily kill a tank. So the way we've set up firepower in Song for War is the symbol inside the box, or symbols, indicate which enemies that unit can actually destroy. So in the case of a fighter here, we can see that its firepower is blue, so it's light, and it can only attack and defend against and destroy enemy air. Nothing else. So at no point in time is a fighter going to be able to destroy an infantry or a tank. But it can, obviously, attack and defend against and destroy all other air units as denoted by the wings. Now, when it does attack and defend, it needs a 7 or higher in order to score a successful hit and destroy an enemy. So firepower includes the color and the level of firepower, blue, yellow, and red. It includes the enemies that it can attack and defend against, as denoted by the symbols, as well as the minimum firepower roll it needs in order to hurt anything and to destroy an enemy. So, for example, a fighter in battle rolls a 7 or higher against any type of blue armor, right? As you can see, every single air unit has a blue armor, which basically means in a battle, a fighter can destroy any of the enemies of these types of air units on a 7 or higher in a battle. Let's give another example. So if we move down to the sea units, for example, you can see aircraft carriers. Now, aircraft carriers are interesting in that, let's take a look at their armor. Aircraft have a split armor, a yellow and a red. So their normal armor is a yellow, which means in order to destroy an aircraft carrier, an enemy must be able to hit sea units, number 1. And number 2, it must have at least a yellow firepower or higher, such as a red firepower, in order to destroy it. Right? That's what the yellow armor indicates. But we also know that aircraft carriers very often also were accompanied by fighters, which made them much tougher. So in the case when an aircraft carrier has fighter coverage, now its armor's red, which makes it even that much tougher to kill. It requires an enemy that can attack and defend against sea units that has a red firepower in order to destroy it, when accompanied by fighters. So it has this 2-level based type of armor. On the firepower side, you can see the aircraft carrier has a yellow, which means it can destroy any, as well as it can attack, by the way, sea units, right? It also has built-in AA, as indicated by this here. So the aircraft carrier not only has a yellow firepower, but it also has AA built in, which means it can attack and defend against air units. And it has, of course, sea power, right? Which means it's able to destroy enemy sea units. At a yellow, and it needs a 9 or higher. So for example, when engaged in battle against enemy sea units, right? At a yellow firepower, at a 9 or higher, it can destroy blue armor here, right? Such as the destroyer. It can destroy a cruiser, right? Because the cruiser's armor is also yellow, so that means the aircraft carrier can destroy it. And so the aircraft carrier can be a pretty powerful unit in that regard, in addition to its AA, which means it can also hurt all of these planes when engaged in battle. And that's really, so all those dynamics about how armor and firepower interplay against each other, especially when you have multiple units in the game, is really what adds a lot of the fun and the dynamics of each battle.
All right, go ahead.
So one of the questions we also get is if, it has to be what we say like to like, say blue firepower to blue armor, then how can one unit possibly kill a tougher unit? Well, we've also got a mechanic built in for that because, you never know. Once in a while you get a lucky shot, right? And there are three mechanics. There's one mechanic with three different levels that really allows some variability in the game. So, for example, and it's all by these white hexagons here. Any unit that has a white hexagon with an arrow in it, right? And that includes infantry, that includes cruisers, that includes destroyers, and that includes light bombers. Any units with that, whenever they roll a boldface 12 or whenever they roll a 12, that really means that their firepower levels up one. So, for example, typically in infantry, almost always has a blue firepower, and it can attack and defend against green star land units. So what if an infantry faces a tank? Well, if that infantry rolls a 12 in battle, that blue 12 levels up to a yellow, and now that infantry can hurt a yellow armored unit. So when you think about these different types of units, whether that's, right, cruisers now can level up potentially and hurt a red armor. If that's the case, it can kill a battleship, right? Or you can see here a destroyer can level up and hurt a yellow armor, which means a destroyer in this case can actually take down a cruiser or potentially an aircraft carrier that is not accompanied by fighters, right? So that gives a lot of variability and allows the units to level up. In addition to level up, we have a +1, which really for every 12 that's rolled, that unit gets an additional die roll, right? So it's like a knock-on effect almost, right? So for example, the one that probably gets the most attention is artillery, but also in heavy bombers, right? Because heavy bombers get to roll, they have a 9 or higher, and they actually roll 5 dice at any time. So for every 12 a heavy bomber rolls, it gets to roll another die, which sort of has this heavy bomber knock-on effect and where it can really hurt a lot of different units. The last item is this crosshairs, which means this unit, whenever it rolls a 12, gets to actually choose the unit that it destroys, the enemy. In most cases, we'll get to taking casualties. In most cases, the nation that owns the unit, right, gets to choose which casualty it takes. But if you roll a 12 with a fighter, now you get to pick which enemy unit is destroyed, which can be very helpful, for example, because if a heavy bomber is in the vicinity and you really want to hurt that heavy bomber earlier, if you roll a 12 as a fighter, you can hurt and you can take that enemy heavy bomber as your choice. So you have level up, you have +1 roll, and you have precise hit. The game is played in order of play in what we refer to as stages, as well as phases. So I'm going to give the larger 1942 full scenario here so you can get a sense of how these work. There are up to 6 stages in the 1942 full scenario. And again, each stage has 4 phases. So for each stage, all of the players will do 4 things. Okay? Tactical phase, which is moving your units, declaring your battles, and resolving those battles. Victory phase, which is you simply count up the victory points for each side, a very quick phase. If the Allies have reached enough victory points to win the game is over. If they have not, the game continues. Right? There is also an automatic victory phase, a victory level for the Axis. However, that's pretty difficult to reach, and if you do reach it, then the Allies have no chance. So in the victory phase, you really just add up your victory points and determine if either side has won. So it's a quick, very quick phase. The third phase of each stage is called national support. And that's where the specific decks to each nation, which you draw some cards, and then you spend some national support tokens, and you can confer with your teammate on this, and you spend some tokens to upgrade your units or receive unique units to that nation, gain some advantages on the battlefield through logistics or strategy or combat engineers, or you're also able to trigger historical events in order to give you an advantage. So that's the national support phase. And the last phase is resupply. And that's simply where you pick based on the objectives that you control, you can then purchase and place new units on the board at different locations. So those are the 4 phases: tactical, victory, national support, and resupply. And those are done in the stages. So in a 42 scenario, I mentioned there's all 6 stages. What's interesting about the game is that really one of the mechanics we built in to make it fun is that turn order. So in stage 1, the Allies, being the invaders, always go first in every phase. So they're the first to move and declare In the tactical, they're the first to check for victory, first to national support, right? Get their national support, and they're the first to resupply if they so choose. So that's a first mover advantage in stage 1. And then the allies get to do first mover advantage in stages 1, 3, and 5. But the Axis are the first to act in stages 2, 4, and 6. So this really gives a very interesting dynamic in the gameplay about who's going first, who's counterattacking, and really be able to plan ahead to sort of predict the moves of your opponent and then strategize how you can sort of either feint a certain direction or think differently in order to predict and anticipate what's going to happen, either as the attacker or fundamentally a counterattacker. So that variation really adds a different layer. And everything is simultaneous in the game. So, when the allies go first in stage 1 and they're the first in the tactical phase, you don't wait for each nation. The allies move simultaneously, either as individual nations or together. If Great Britain and the U.S. want to move units into a single space together and make an attack, they can do it. If they want to move separately, they can do it. So there's a lot less downtime in the game and allows for much more collaboration and simultaneous play. The war wasn't fought nation by nation and waiting for each nation to go. And this game is not fought nation by nation. It's done as a side, just as they did in the war. So let's get into some quick examples of the phases and how they work for gameplay. The first and the most involved phase of the game is the tactical phase. And the tactical phase is where Allied and Axis nations get to move their units, declare battles, and then resolve the battles that they declared. This is also where nations will maintain control of or win or lose control of objectives, airfields, and defensive lines. This is a very important part of the game because by controlling these, of course, as we discussed earlier, is how victory is had. So during the tactical phase, the tactical phase works on what we call movement steps, right? And these are probably the core mechanic of the game. The movement steps are designed to emulate exactly how the war was fought and requires thinking about how combined forces work together. And the way the movement steps work, in which there are 6, the steps are unit-based. Lighter, faster units, they get to move and declare battles and resolve those battles in more than one movement step. Quicker, lighter, faster units. So fighters, for example, get a chance to move and get into battles on movement step 1, movement step 2, and then they also get to move and return to their airfields on movement step 6. So that's 3 times a fighter can move, and on each of those times it could move its full movement of 4 spaces. So you can see that creates a lot of movement on the board. Now, heavier, slower units only get 1 movement step to do so, right? So a battleship, for example, is obviously a very heavy but somewhat slower unit. And the rest of the sea units really mostly only get to move on movement step 3. So 1 movement step. Some units are sort of like more mobile units, such as tanks, get to move on movement step 4 and 5, or land transports on 4 and 5. But as you can see, as you go through the movement steps, right, for each movement step in order as you proceed through them, you can see how the different types of movement in which units get to move really becomes layered, and you have to think about the combined forces. Now, during the game, during each tactical phase, you move through the steps in order, 1 through 6. And I mentioned earlier that when on stages 1, 3, and 5, the allies are always the first to act. So, for example, in stage 1, during the tactical phase, the allies will be the first to move all of their fighters and all of their subs in movement step 1. They'll declare any battles that they want to resolve, the allies, and then they'll resolve those battles. When the allies have moved and declared and resolved their battles for their fighters and submarines on movement step 1, the Axis then has a chance to counter, to move its fighters, submarines, and declare any battles and resolve those battles. That is done for each of the movement steps 1 through 6. Allies first, Axis second, until you're done with each of the movement steps. And when the movement steps are done, the tactical phase is over. Now remember, when you get to the second stage, or the 4th or 6th stage of the game, now the Axis are first to move in each of the movement steps. So it really creates a variation in terms of the movement and how to resolve the battles. Now when you're resolving battles, you're doing the second item, the column that you see there in red, and those are the battle steps. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense in a battle to have a bunch of dice flying around and not everything shoots and fires at the same time. So we've also emulated this process by having battle steps. Anti-air are first because they need to sort of clear some of the airspace, right? They're the first to go. followed by fighters, which are really they're designed to clear the airspace in order to escort bombers and light bombers and heavy bombers, and they resolve on step 3, right? So the idea is you're able to really think about how these combined forces work together, not only in how they move and declare, but also in how battles are resolved in the resolution of casualties. So to give you a quick example of how this works, we're going to take you to an invasion of Tunis. So let's look at how the movement steps come to life as part of the game, and we'll take a look at one of the movement steps as well as sort of quickly go through one battle. In this case, we are going to look at movement step 5. Now, let's assume this is in stage 1 of the game, which means the Allied nations are the first to move and act throughout the stage, which includes it's now going to be their turn, right, to move and declare any battles on movement step 5. Movement step 5 includes tanks, land transports, and infantry. Now, the only units that are able to move and declare battles are the ones depicted in that movement step. So movement step 5, again, tanks, land transports, and infantry. And it's the Allies' turn. So let's go ahead and move them. So the Allies decide, here around Tunis, we have the United States in green, Great Britain in blue, and we have the Germans, which hold Tunis currently, here in the red. So let's move. The United States is going to load up on its land transport, right? You can load, move, and unload all in the same movement step. It's all one smooth motion. So the U.S. is going to bring their troops in. The U.S. also has a tank to the south. It's going to move into to Tunis. And the British have an infantry. It's going to move into Tunis. But the British will decide to keep its artillery back because artillery have a range and can provide supporting fire to the battle without having to move in. But what's interesting is that the British also have a cruiser out here, which will be able to provide supporting fire. But the Germans also have an artillery within range also that can provide supporting fire, which we'll get to in a moment. And by rule, anytime you end your movement in a space that contains only enemies of any enemy, right? As long as it's controlled only by enemies, you have to declare a battle, which is fine because the Allies are trying to take Tunis. So we will place a battle declaration marker in Tunis. Now, in the movement step, it's entirely possible that the Allies may be moving tanks and land transports and all over the board, and they may have 3 or 4 or 5 battles to resolve, which is fine. It's up to the Allies, once they've moved and declared, which order they want to resolve in. So obviously, in this case, we just have the one. So let's proceed. Whenever resolving a battle, you follow the battle steps on the player aid. And though these are also done in order 1 through 7. And after each battle step, you remove casualties. That's important because these battle steps are designed to emulate the power of combined forces, right? And the different abilities of each unit to help you win a fight. So the more diverse forces you have and combined forces you have, the better the chances are going to be that you'll win. But you resolve these in order. So let's start with battle step 1, AA. Now, the Germans do have an AA here in Tunis, but if you look at the AA's firepower, AA are only allowed to fight and defend against enemy air. Okay? The Germans have no enemies to attack. The German anti-air unit has no enemies to defend against. There are no Allied air units in Tunis. Move on. Movement step 2. Fighters. Same situation. There's no fighters here of either side, right? So there's nothing to do for movement step 2. Skip. Movement step 3. Okay, now we have a unit. The Germans have a light bomber here defending Tunis. And if you look at the light bomber firepower, light bombers are able to attack and defend against enemy land units. And there are certainly enemy land units in Tunis. So let's take... the light bomber has a yellow firepower, and it needs an 8 or higher to hit an enemy land unit. Aha! So, interesting. The light bomber rolled a 12, okay? Which is, now that triggers, right, when we talked about earlier, the level up ability of the white hex with the red arrow in it. That triggers the level up ability of the light bomber, which means its yellow firepower now becomes a red firepower. Let's talk about casualties. When removing casualties, the formula is simple. It's on the player aid. For every firepower blue hit, you need to take 1 enemy unit with a blue armor. For every yellow firepower hit, you need to take 2 enemies with a blue armor or 1 enemy with a yellow armor. And for a red firepower hit, casualties are taken either 3 blue, 2 yellow, or 1 red armored enemy. Okay? So it's this sort of stacking effect. So the light bomber, the German light bomber rolling a 12, that yellow becomes a red, which means that the United States and Great Britain have to come up with either 2 yellow or 3 blue. Well, it doesn't have 2 yellow because the armor yellow for the tank is the only yellow it has, but it does have 4 units, 2, 3, 4, with the blue armor. So that means that 1, this red hit requires 2 and 3. That's quite a hit, right? That leaves, so these are immediately removed at the end of the battle step. Light bomber is complete, and the Allies took a big hit there. Movement step 3 is now done. We move to movement step 4. Are there any subs or destroyers? There are not. Movement step 5. Aha, this includes artillery as well as heavier ships. Okay, so now we've got a series of players in here. The British have 2 artillery to the south, the Germans with 1 artillery, and we have this cruiser that also gets to roll and within range. So let's start with the British. The British cruiser, if you look at the firepower on the player aid, receives 1 roll at a yellow firepower, and it can attack any type of enemy, so it can attack the land units, and it receives 1 blue. So let's roll the yellow and the blue for the cruiser. There are 2 misses, so the cruiser does not provide the Allies any help. Now the British do have 2 artillery to the south, which we'll roll for. 6 and 4, the yellow and 8 or higher. No luck. The invasion is not going very well for the Brits. Now, the Germans, however, do have this artillery to the south to provide some help to Tunis, of which it rolls an 11. So now, on our yellow artillery hit, your options for casualties are either 1 yellow armored enemy or 2 blue. Well, right now the Allies only have these 2 units left, so it has to be 1 yellow, so the tank must be taken as a casualty. And now battle step 5, I apologize, is now over. We now make our way to battle step 6 for tanks and infantry. Lots here, right? We're in Tunis. So let's go ahead, and this is only 1 infantry left for the Allies, and the green United States infantry has a firepower of blue at a 9 or higher. Okay, and it rolls the 9, so it does. So the Germans will have to take a blue casualty, but at the same time, the Germans get to roll for a tank and this infantry here. So the Germans roll for their tank at a yellow firepower as a miss at a 3, and then they have a blue at a 9, and that's a miss, so we will remove casualties. The only casualty taken is this American did do 1 blue, so we'll take this little blue here, this AA, blue armored unit for the Germans, and our battle is complete. So the good news for the Allies is that they're able to at least survive 1 round of the battle, and they have contested Tunis. The bad news for the Allies is it doesn't look good as the prospects. As we continue to go through the movement steps now, more battles can be activated, and a good chance the Axis will be kicking the Allies out. So let's talk about the phase 3 now, and that's national support. Keep in mind, we're not going to get into the details of the victory phase simply because it's easy. You count the victory points and you determine if any of the nations or the sides meet the conditions to win. If not, you move on. So in phase 3 is national support, and this is where each nation has an opportunity to draw on some benefits, unit upgrades or events or other things in order to give it advantage on the battlefield. Now these cards were designed specifically, all of them are pretty powerful, right? There's nothing that's kind of a throwaway or type of a weak card. We design these in such a way that they can be real game changers, all of them to a certain extent. Now each nation has its own unique deck, right? Some of them have some shared cards, but each nation has units that are unique to it, sort of specific events that it can use. So there are 4 types of cards in each deck. There are, right, this is an event card, which is an Allied War Trade Agreement. This is an example for the US deck, where they're allowed to really boost their own production or resupply and hurt the production of the Axis enemies, okay? A second type of card in the deck is a unit upgrade. This is where every unit on the board and every unit you produce of that unit in the future is permanently upgraded. In this case, the Sherman tank, the United States, if they spend it and they activate this card, they upgrade all of their tanks to Sherman tanks, which brings special abilities. The third card is the B-17 Flying Fortress. Right? This is a unique unit, incredibly powerful, which allows you to introduce the B-17 Flying Fortress to the game. And the fourth card is Counterintelligence. This is a strategic card, right? So you've got event, unit upgrade, unique unit, and then sort of a strategy card, which allows you to really confuse the enemy and move some of their units around, as well as relocate some of your own units to give you the best advantage. So those are the 4 types of cards that you can get. So let's run through an example of how national support works. At the beginning of the national support phase, each nation receives 2 national support to spend, 2 tokens. 2 tokens, by the way, reminder, you are looking at a prototype, so it's going to look somewhat differently when the time comes, and 2 tokens for the United States. So let's go to Germany. Germany has its 2 tokens and national support to spend. At the beginning of the national support phase, you choose 2 cards from the top of your deck. Germany chooses and receives Rommel arrives, which is an event card that costs 2 NS, and the unit upgrade to the Stuka Junkers 87 Stuka dive bomber, which would upgrade every one of its light bombers. So let's say, for example, Rommel arrives allows us to really strengthen Benghazi and bring all kind of units there, which sort of emulates at when Hitler decided to assign Rommel in North Africa. And the Stuka obviously is an advantage because it creates every light bomber that you have on the board now and any future light bomber into a Stuka, which gives it additional abilities. So I think as a German, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to spend my 2 national support and I'm going to activate the Stuka. Now every light bomber I have on the board and anything I produce light bomber in the future is a Stuka. I keep this card up. Rommel arrives, however, stays in my hand and I can choose to activate it later in a future national support phase. Now you may elect to not spend any of your national support. That's entirely your choice. And by the way, you can save it up for bigger cards later. And by the way, you can confer with your teammate about what to activate and try to sort of stack the abilities of the cards that are given in order to give your side the best advantage. So let's talk about the final phase of each stage, and that is resupply. Resupply now is designed in this game that you shouldn't have to resupply the same location on the board every single time, right? The reason sides took objectives is that they could resupply any forward positions or resupply any back positions, right? Depending on how much they could resupply at any given location. So it has to be a dynamic type of mechanic that allows some fun in the game. The way it works in Song for War Mediterranean Theater is that each nation is able to supply 1 land, 1 sea, and 1 air resupply across all of the objectives it controls. It has to choose 1 land, 1 sea, and 1 air from across all the objectives. So what do we mean by that? If you take a look at the board right now, let's just take Germany. Germany, indicated by the red, controls the majority of the board at this point, right? At least at the start of the game. As you can see, Germany controls Naples, Palermo, Tunis, Bizerte. Let's make our way to North Africa, Tobruk, and up here in the Balkans, Crete, Athens, and Thessaloniki. That's a lot of objectives. Now the Germans have to choose 1 land, 1 sea, and 1 air from across those. Now the way you help determine it is you can look at these values. Let's take Tunis. Tunis has a resupply value of green star land of 12. Up to 12 spend cost in land units can be placed there. 11 sea and 10 air. Okay? Now, these are all very different. Palermo's different. Naples is different. So to give us the maximum advantage, now obviously there's no units on the board which would influence where you want to place these. But by way of example, let's decide, Germany decides it's going to resupply 12 land at Tunis. Okay? On the player aid, you can see the costs of the different units. And we'll say, for example, for its 12 land in Tunis, the Germans will decide it's going to purchase 3 tanks at 4 each. 12 spent, resupplied land at Tunis. Now let's look here at Palermo. Palermo actually has a very strong air component at a 12 resupply for air. That was an air base for Germany. So we're going to go ahead and resupply our air at Palermo for the Germans. And we're going to supply 1 heavy bomber at 6 of a cost. That's half of my value. And the Germans are also going to provide 2 fighters and 1 light bomber, each costing 2. Now I've spent my full complement of 12 air at Palermo. Air is resupplied. And then my final choice for the Germans will be over here in Athens, resupply of 13 sea. And so we know battleships cost 12, and sea transports cost me a total of 1. So I'm going ahead and put on my battleship. It has to be an adjacent sea space to the land, to the objective. We will put my battleship here into L6, and I receive a single sea transport at also an L6. That costs us 12, 13 total. So I've met my complement of sea. Sea, land, air. This is done for every single nation. And every single nation has, and you can confer with your teammate to decide how you want to resupply at a forward position or a back position that gives you the best advantage in the battles. I hope you enjoyed this introductory video of Song for War Mediterranean Theater by Victor X Games. If you have any questions, or any rule clarifications, or any suggestions about the design or gameplay, feel free to email me, Chris, at invictorxgames@gmail.com or visit our website, invictorx.com. Thanks for watching.